Welcome to another Flip video. Today we'll be talking about the checks and balances within the three branches of our government. Plus we'll be talking about how amendments are actually made to our Constitution. Let's begin. Members of our Constitution were very smart individuals. You see, they knew that once a group of people or one person got power in the government, that they may very well be tempted to get more and more and more power and subsequently control everything, which is what happened under King George. So, to make sure that this didn't happen, the people in the convention split our government up into three parts. This way, the government's power would be limited. You see, they wanted a balance between a strong government to protect people's rights, but to make sure that that power didn't become overwhelming to the point that the government controlled everything. The way they did this was to ensure that each branch of our government had separate and unique powers. This would ensure that none of the branches would get enough power to dominate another branch. Hence, we get the phrase separation of powers. To go with this separation of powers, we have what's called checks and balances. It's a way to make sure that one branch doesn't get too strong and dominate the others. Let's talk first about the checks part of this. Now, this allows one branch to block another branch's actions if it seems bad for the people and country. Because we don't want the branches constantly fighting with each other, because nothing will get done in our country. So this should only be used if the actions seem not good for us. Let's go through some examples. First off, the executive branch can veto any congressional bill. The president, who's the head of the executive branch, doesn't have to sign a bill into law. They can veto it. That's the way that they check the legislative branch. On the other side, the legislative branch, with a 2/3 majority in Congress, can override a presidential veto. So if a president vetoes something and says, no, that bill can't become law, the legislative branch, with 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate, can still make that bill become a law. Also, the legislative branch can impeach judges too. So right here we have an example where the legislative branch can check the power of the president and check the power of the federal judges as well. I want to take a look at this chart right here. This chart shows the last few presidents we've had in our country, minus President Trump. And it tells you how many vetoes they used throughout their terms. Each dot represents one veto. The colored dots also tells us if Congress used their 2/3 majority to override the veto or not. So as you can see here, President Obama had 2 vetoes. Neither of them were overrid. They were sustained, so they stayed. If we look down here, we can see that Ronald Reagan did a whole bunch of vetoes, and a few of them were overridden with the 2/3 majority. So, to give you another example of how a president can use a veto and how Congress can use their 2/3 majority, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had 635 vetoes. Congress used their 2/3 override only 9 times. Andrew Johnson, another president of ours, had 29 vetoes. However, Congress did their 2/3 majority 15 times. That's over 50% of his vetoes were overridden. So you can tell that Congress really had to keep President Johnson in check there. Finally, the judicial branch has what's called the judicial review, where they can say that any law or treaty is unconstitutional. And that is how the judicial branch is able to keep both the executive and the legislative branch in check. Checks stop an action that has already begun that may harm people or citizens of our country. Balances allow one branch to influence another so that nothing unconstitutional begins in the first place. For example, the executive branch nominates judges that look into whether or not laws are constitutional. So right there, there's the balance between the executive and the judicial. The legislative approves judge nominations from the president, and they're the ones that also okay peace treaties from the president. So again, here's the legislative balancing out the executive and the judicial branch to make sure that things are okay before something bad begins. Finally, we have the judicial branch, which can reject treaties outright, even before something bad can happen with those. Next, let's talk about how amendments or changes can be made to our Constitution. Now, as I kind of mentioned, changes and amendments can actually happen to our Constitution. However, as you're about to learn, it's very difficult to do this. I want you to pause the video for a moment and just think about why it has to be difficult to change our Constitution. Pause the video now. Hopefully you paused the video and you thought about my question about why it has to be difficult. And maybe you thought it has to be difficult because if you can change our Constitution easily, you can easily change the way our country works, which means it can be changed for bad. Also, if you think about it, culture changes, kind of ebbs and flows. And if we can change our Constitution every time our culture changes, bad things can happen. Because if we look back in history, our culture may change. However, there's always elements of our culture that stay the same. So changing our Constitution, our law, may not always be in the best interest of our nation. Now, there are two ways to propose a change to the Constitution, plus there are actually two ways to ratify our Constitution as well. This was done to ensure that both the state governments and the federal governments have a say and a chance either to start or stop an amendment from happening to our Constitution. So let's talk about how that actually occurs. Now, to propose an amendment, tongue twister, the following needs to happen to ask for a national convention. First off, what you could have happen is having 2/3 of each part of our Congress propose an amendment. Now that would be 66 people in the Senate and 290 people in the House. So those two numbers have to occur in Congress in order for an amendment to be proposed to the National Convention. Or you could have 2/3 of all the state legislatures agree to propose an amendment. So that means you have to have 33 of our 50 legislatures. Which do you think is going to be harder to have happen? Which might be easier? I don't know about you. I think having the legislatures would be probably harder. Now, once an amendment has been proposed, there's two ways to get that amendment ratified, to get it signed off and okayed. First, you could have 3/4 of all the state legislatures agree to it, which ends up being 38 state legislatures out of 50. Or you could have 3/4 of special conventions from each state vote for it. Again, that would be 38 of the conventions. Now, just to let you know, there's been 27 amendments passed in our country's history out of, wait for it, 11,699 proposed amendments. That's a lot. So as you can see, it's very hard to get amendments passed. Thank you for watching this flip video. Please go to Edmodo to check the homework. Also, there will be an extra credit question, so look for that. Thank you.
I propose an amendment that any student who doesn't get his homework done gets his or her cell phone taken away for life. Ha 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 ha.
Mr. Mint?
Yeah?
I don't think the state legislatures or Congress would pass that.
Oh. Good point. Well, maybe we can get it to be that M&Ms are banned from being allowed to be eaten.
Mr. Mint, that might be way easier to pass.
Good point.